Hi guys, welcome to the Revive Stronger podcast. I'm your host as always, Steve Hall, and today I'm very excited to be joined by Paul Carter, who has not been on the podcast before, so I'll definitely make sure you know who he is, although I'm sure many of you already know who he is, and obviously Mike Israetel, who's been on the show many times before. So Paul is a prolific writer, so if any of you have been on T Nation at any point, you will have seen an article by Paul. He's written for Flex Magazine, Muscle and Fitness. He specializes in hypertrophy and body recomposition, which is very similar to Mike, and this is some of the things they're going to be talking about. And he coaches pro bodybuilders and elite strength athletes. Anything else you want to add to that, Paul?
No, I hate the bio and intro stuff because it always feels so self-indulgent.
And I mean, looking at him, you can tell he's jacked, at least if you're watching this over on YouTube, and he is a jacked guy. You can check him out on Instagram, and I'll make sure that's all linked below as well. So if you don't know Mike, he has a PhD in sports physiology. He is the chief sports scientist for Renaissance Periodization and a prolific author for them, doing many books over there. And he is the former professor of exercise and sports science. So today we're going to be talking about hypertrophy, if people couldn't guess. And I think at least this has been something our audience has asked to happen, for Paul and Mike to kind of talk through some aspects of that, because I think sometimes, at least from the outside in, I think it was the same when kind of I had Eric and Mike on for the first time. Everyone thought they were going to kind of strangle each other's necks and kind of thought about things completely differently. And I think maybe we'll draw some lines where there's some similarities and maybe there'll be some disagreements. And at least I think we're kind of get further to the truth through this discussion, because both of these guys obviously specialize in this area. So I wonder if, Paul, you want to start out with kind of your general principles for hypertrophy, maybe what you think the main drivers are, how you like to kind of tell people to train, and how you like to program. I know that's a very kind of broad question, but maybe just kind of the broad strokes there.
Yeah, so from a kind of 20,000 foot view of how I approach good training cycles as far as like muscle growth is, the first part is really finding, I think in each individual does himself a big justice by trying to find movements that really fit his structure very well. Some people, one of the things that I go on about quite a bit is not everybody's built to squat, to tax their quads as well as other guys. Not everybody's going to be built like Tom Platz and get the kind of output that Tom Platz gets from, say, high bar squats. So it behooves people to find movements that really fit their structure for what it is they're trying to get out of their training sessions. And then from there, actually being able to execute them so that you can target the tissue very effectively, so that the greatest amount of tension is actually going onto the muscles that you're trying to train. And from that part, once you get those things in line, it's essentially just about mechanically overloading the muscle every week. And it just comes back to progressive overload within, a good rep range. So, I mean, that's kind of the high level overview of how I approach things. And then there's a million nuances from there that we can bullshit back and forth about over the next hour.
And I know one of your at least I know one of the areas where maybe you guys divide, and this might be a place to start, and then you can kind of go back and forth, is the relationship between kind of volume and intensity. So I believe you're more on the side of higher intensity, lower volume for the most part, once you found those exercises that you're executing well.
Well, it all depends. Like, I think when we talk about intensity, and like in this discussion, Mike will define that as just like effort, right?
Yeah, relative intensity.
Mike, wake up.
There's a couple ways to define it. And then if we start talking about specifics, we have to define it specifically. So like there's absolute intensity, which is just what percent of 1RM you're lifting. Right. Then there's relative intensity, which is sort of usually reps in reserve. Like how close to what you put weight on the bar, how close to your absolute concentric failure point are you lifting in a set, which can be to it, and it can be beyond it even if you do 4 reps or something like that. So usually when people talk about intensity nowadays, because they use loading for how much weight is on the bar, it's a more popular term. I think it's also a better term. I think when we say intensity, we're talking about relative intensity, which is reps in reserve, basically.
Yeah, that's interesting that you bring that up. I use the term loading now better, because the term intensity depending on the context of the conversation, can get really people very confused. So I'll just say loading for whatever's on the bar, and then effort for basically how you're defining as a relative intensity or your perceived intensity or effort within the set.
For sure. I think that's great. Also, intensity, I think, doesn't mess people up because some people think it's like a psychological thing. Like, will I really get after it? Like, okay, I know you get after it. Everyone thinks they get after it. So it's not very objective, and it just confuses the shit out. People say like intensity is important in a bodybuilding article. And people are like, yeah. Let's headphones in and just do this shit. Like, it's a little bit, you can get a little bit more quantifiable than that.
Yeah, and that's, for our discussion, we can just say what loading and then effort or whatever, however we want to define that. But coming back to that, is so going back to my original part there is like what I consistently try to shoot for is efficiency. So that's why it comes back to making sure that you're doing a good job of finding movements that fit your structure, fit your body type, and what it is you're trying to perform. For example, you get a guy that's got really, like I was going back with the squat discussion, you get a guy that's got really long femurs, short torso, and he wants to build his quads. Mike knows this as well as I do. It's like everybody, the really low level kind of shit to throw at people, say, well, if you want big legs, go squat. That's really not always the best answer for everybody, right? If you have a structure of a Tom Platz, then doing high bar squats, for 10, 15, 20 reps or whatever, might be a really good selection for you. But if you are built like Manute Bol, then you're probably going to have to approach building quads a little bit differently than the Tom Platz guy is. So, and there's a multitude of other things. I work with 2 guys right now in person multiple times a week, and I don't do that much. But one of the guys is a competitor. He took 5th at the Amateur Olympia this last year. Something as simple as doing a rear delt row. The amount of transverse shoulder extension that's going to happen, how the arm's going to pull behind the body, can vary as far as the degrees of abduction that's going to happen with the humerus, right? As far as which the angle that they're going to be in relative to the torso in order to fully shorten the rear delt. So one guy, he doesn't have very much abduction of the humerus in order to shorten the rear delts, where the other guy is far more flared out. So all of these little things, they kind of require you to work with somebody to move properly in conjunction with your structure. If you take, say, a big fat guy, his movements are going to look different than a guy who's very lean and doesn't have very much fat on his body. So when you start talking about finding movements that fit your structure, usually it takes somebody to potentially work with you, or for you just to do a lot of due diligence on figuring out those things yourself. There's some base levels. But then from there, just proper execution. And when you get all of those things narrowed down and you're very efficient with mechanically loading the right tissue, I've found that at that point, that's kind of when you play with how many sets you're going to do. And one of the things I've been going back and forth, Mike's kind of like we've been talking about with the whole loading versus effort and intensity stuff, is when we talk about, I think we're kind of at a precipice where when we talk about volume, what we're really talking about, and I was thinking about this going into this discussion, what we're really talking about, right, is stimulus, right? Like to some degree, what we're talking about is how much stimulus we want to get out of the training session, right? How much stimulus we can recover from. So when we talk about volume, and Mike can correct me if I'm wrong, Mike, you manipulate volume in conjunction with effort in order to get a certain degree of stimulus out of the training sessions, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's say we take, just to keep things super simple for just a
if we can, white belt the shit out of this, right?
Yeah, 100%. So let's say all of our sets are to failure, and then we have to ask the question of, because they're to failure is standardized, right? And let's say we really know how to get to true failure. And let's say which
I think is something that has to be cultivated in your training too, right?
100%. But let's say we know that, then we ask sort of the theoretical question of how many sets to true failure is it going to take to get any net hypertrophy, some net hypertrophy, maximum hypertrophy, and then how many is so many that one of two things happens. Either you're doing 12 sets instead of 8 per week, but you get the same hypertrophy from 12 and 8 because 10 was that loop. And the next question, because that's fucking stupid, 4 extra sets for the same growth because you're doing so much damage, it's canceling out a bunch of the growth.
100%.
And then also, but you can't really sustain that. So the next important question about volume is how much how many sets to failure does it take so that you can recover your performance session to session or week to week, and then it's just a downward spiral. So I think the volume question is an important one, because I don't think most people are arguing like you just need one set to failure and that's it. Like per week, really? Like I'm going to get big quads if I do one set to failure of leg press per week. That seems highly unlikely. And then you get into discussions of how often to train, and also in discussions how many total sets per week are important. But I think just to make sure we address this point, and you really sort of started and almost finished it, Paul, is when people talk about volume recommendations and for various muscle groups, let's say biceps or back, your point about learning the technique and what can also be termed the mind-muscle connection, not just in general, because there's general good technique and then also specific good technique to your body and choosing the right exercises. If you checkmark all of those things, your degree of stimulus per repetition and per set goes up a lot. Sometimes your fatigue per stimulus can actually go down, which is
right. No, I'm so glad you said that, because that's another part that's a great point. I don't really talk about that a lot, because that's exactly right, because you have a less amount of tension that's being dispersed across the connective tissue.
The shit that doesn't need to be dispersed.
You're effectively loading the muscle tissue as significantly as possible. So what happens is, and that's a great point. I'm so glad you mentioned that, because I was actually going to try to get to that, but that makes my day. So when you do that, the amount of efficiency that you have within the training session, it just goes through the roof, right? Yeah. Because you load the muscle so well, and then you reduce the amount essentially of overall, whether you're talking nervous system fatigue or you're
just systemic in general.
Yeah, it goes down significantly. So you become, that's why it's so important. I try to emphasize this to guys as much as possible. It's so important to take that time out to find good movements that fit you and learn how to perform them with really good biomechanics, because it makes everything else you do so much better.
So like you made a point on the internet earlier, you made a point, something to the extent of, when I see some of these volume recommendations guys are making and guys are saying they're doing, I have a feeling they don't know how to train, because these are outlandish volumes that you shouldn't have to do in order to get where you get. And my colleague James Hoffman and I, who you've met once in Kansas City, we do like a weekly webinar and where we answer people's questions, and they'll send us questions of like, hey, I'm doing this much volume for my back, or I know a guy said he's doing this much volume for his legs, and I still don't feel adequately stimulated. I'm not sore. I don't have fatigue drop off. Like, is my maximum recoverable volume really this high? And it's some outlandish number, like 60 sets for back or something per week. And so what James and I do is, this is really, James made this up, so I'm paraphrasing him. He like applies a skeptic filter immediately to extreme volumes, and then we'll talk to you about maybe your MRV is high. So basically he's like, okay, when someone says to me, I do 40 sets of rows and 30 sets of pull-ups per week, and my back still isn't growing and doesn't feel taxed, the number one thing isn't for us to speculate like, wow, maybe you're a genetic outlier, which is still totally possible, right? Like gymnasts can do stuff like that and it's fine.
There's some guys fall in there. What I call them is like almost like non-responders.
Totally. Yeah. Like you just pure slow twitch. You're infinitely recoverable. Nothing ever happens.
Right.
But before we get to that, to your point, we got to make sure, like my James's response is, I want you to show me what you think a bent row looks like. And then they send you a video and you're like, no. That's not a bent row. And then they properly do a full range of motion bent row. And they're like, oh my God, I feel it everywhere. Holy shit. Like my lats, oh man, this is really fatiguing. And I have a huge pump. It's like, well, how many sets of that do you think you need a week? They do 20 sets instead of 40, and they're getting super amazing growth. So before you talk, because sometimes people say like, oh, I need XYZ number of sets to grow. There's always needs to be a skepticism applied to that. First, show me a video at least, and that you're, at least from an outward angle, that your shit doesn't look completely insane. Because, we've all seen claims of like, oh man, I can do 40 sets of quads per workout. Then you see what they call quad work, which is like leg extensions with this range of motion, leg presses with this range of motion. For like, motherfucker, that you did 0 reps. I'm still counting 0, 0, 0, 0. You haven't done any reps yet. So when you do proper fucking lifting, at that point, usually your volume is cut in half from what you thought it was. And you can still have way higher volume than other people, but it has to be applied first, because talking to people about volume before they're doing things remotely correctly is just a downward slope to just them pissing away more time with shitty efficiency.
Literally, Mike, that's a great point. And that's exactly what I make to people. There's no point talking about programming or volume or sets or reps or whatever until I can understand what your execution looks like. Because that is the very first thing that's got to be fixed. And that's something that really, I mean, it needs to be pounded home to so many guys. There was a guy here locally, it's a great point, that was a pro. I think it's like 500,000 followers here. He was a pro, and he was doing the same kind of thing. He was doing more than 20 sets of like back work twice a week in his sessions because he had no lat development. So literally when I look at what he's doing, all the work he's doing and the way he's doing it is working all the muscles that are attached to his scapula. His lats are getting almost no stimulation. And he's doing like 40 plus sets a week for back, right? He's posting his up. I'm like, what are you doing for your fucking lats though? And he's like, well, I'm doing all this stuff. Like a standard lat pull down, like it doesn't really, it doesn't really stimulate the lats to grow. It's usually muscle of the upper back. The humerus is actually being directed. The motion of the humerus in traditional lat pull downs is being directed by the muscles that are attached to the scapula, right? You have to be able to have humeral depression in order to fully shorten the lats. So I told him, I was like, look, you're not even training your fucking lats. They're not growing because you're not training them. But he was doing 40 plus sets a week. I mean, at that amount of sets, there's going to be some stimulation, right? That's happening because it's just so much stimulation, right? That's what I was getting back to earlier. It's like when we talk about volume, I think it's better for me, you, anybody, when we're talking to people to get away and say, okay, what's the stimulation of a training session, right? And in his case, he was doing a lot of sets, but he wasn't stimulating his lats to grow at all because he wasn't loading them.
Yeah, but he's probably fatiguing a whole lot. You know, you see guys, quote unquote, bent rowing 405 where they're just sort of like chicken dancing with it. And you're like, I'm not really sure what that's kind of a deadlift, maybe a glute thrust while standing.
Loading the erectors pretty well.
Sure, yeah, but not in any standardized way you can track. And if you just did deadlifts with good technique, your erectors would be even bigger, but you could actually like stay safe. It's so funny too. I've seen guys get injured bent rowing like with crazy wobbly form, and they're like, man, that sucks. I got hurt. I want to be like, no, it doesn't, you dumb asshole. You had this coming. You had this coming from day one. You just thought you were immune to injury or some shit like that. Like I have zero tolerance for people doing stupid junk volume, which is basically what it is, and then being like, oh, I got hurt. Or like, oh man, my back won't grow. Well, you've never trained your back. You have no idea what that even means. Like you've never done, I remember this is super interesting. So RIP Franco Colombo was asked if he had ever done weighted pull-ups. Now, so just a quick aside, I do believe there is a place for weighted pull-ups in a program if you choose to do them. But his answer was, I don't have almost anyone ever do weighted pull-ups. And they were like, well, that's crazy. Why not? He's like, okay, first of all, how do you do a pull-up? And they're like, well, like this. And they do the bullshit pump reps. And he's like, no, a pull-up is from a dead hang all the way to your chin every time over the bar. He's like, how many pull-ups can you do now? And they're like, fuck, like 10? I thought I could do 25. He's like, okay, so you can grow a lot with sets of 10. They're like, okay. And they're like, what if I get really strong? They're like, then you touch the bar convincingly to your clavicle. Do you guys understand how fucking hard it is to touch the bar to your clavicle in pull-ups? Fuck. And then he says, if someone can do that, I switch them to sternum. So they touch the bar to the sternum every time for pull-ups and hold for a second. If you can do 10 pull-ups touching the sternum and you weigh more than 180 pounds, your back is going to have another back attached to that shit. You're going to be fucking massive. So is that the only way to grow back? No, but it illustrates the point of like what people think an exercise is. Sometimes you're really doing a half-assed version of that doesn't really target the muscles you want. It sort of gets the work done. And it leaves you with a shitload of fatigue. Because imagine, I've seen guys, I'm sure you guys have seen this, strap like 345s to their waist and do like this shit. And they're like, yeah, man, weighted pull-ups. Like, if it makes you feel nice. But the funny thing is, even taking the 45s off the rack and putting them on the belt is extra systemic fatigue you straight up don't need.
Yeah, and the thing is, a lot of guys don't like to hear this because it's so much more fun to pick ego building exercises where you can move a fuck ton of weight in short ranges of motion. For example, a sumo deadlift, right? It's not really a good hypertrophy lift. It's to put you in a great mechanical position to lift the greatest load as possible with the muscles doing the least amount of work through the range of motion.
That's almost the opposite of what you want in bodybuilding, right? Literally.
It's exactly the opposite of what you want, right? Like what you really want is you want it to be able to create as much tension across the length of tension relationship in a muscle when it's working. So in other words, you end up having to use the loading is probably pretty low, but you get a significant amount of mechanical tension during the set because you're loading across a greater length of the muscle, right? So generally speaking, when guys are picking movements and they're doing like a lot of rack pulls or sumo deadlifts or, stuff where you've got a really good mechanical advantage over the weight, those are poor exercise selections to mechanically load the actual muscle.
Yeah. I honestly I think rack pulls can have their place in a program, but I'm skeptical when most people use them.
I used to a lot, but the more I've gotten into looking at biomechanics stuff, the more I've gotten away from anything that's allowing me this magnificent leverage advantage over the weight. Probably means that I'm not loading muscle as efficiently as I could be.
Sure. Or in any way, you could be loading it very well, so the stimulus could be just as high, but because you need more weight to accomplish the task, the fatigue just elevates. Like, you've powerlifted, just getting under 600 pounds in a squat takes something from you that you just don't get back right away. You don't get it back for weeks.
I get tagged, either John Meadows or Contreras or somebody, I get tagged at anything anti-deadlift, probably multiple time a week basis, because I think it's like the biggest bullshit lift anymore that you can do. It's a decent glute hamstring movement, works your erectors, not a really good back move, but it takes so much from you systemically. It is, in my opinion, the most systemically demanding lift that you can do, and you would probably be better off doing some normal back work, some bent rows, some pull downs, some lat work that's not going to tax you systemically. And then if you're trying to work your glutes, doing a glute bridge, doing normal hamstring work, all that kind of stuff that you're going to probably target those muscles much more efficiently, and you're not going to tax yourself systemically as anywhere near as hard.
Fantastic. Guys, if I can come in here, I think the chat of this sounds very similar to, I don't know if Paul's heard of Mike's term of the stimulus to fatigue ratio, which is like how much stimulus to the amount of fatigue are you getting? And you guys are basically discussing good exercise selection for great stimulus to fatigue ratio, which I think is fantastic. And for bodybuilding, it's kind of a term that I think you've put a term to something that people kind of know, but people need to think more about, which I think is great. And maybe a point of which, I don't know if you differ on this, but it might be somewhere you differ, is kind of the fatigue, stimulus to fatigue ratio of relative intensity. So where you get the most stimulus for the least fatigue, or if and the relationship there. I don't know if Mike wants to talk through.
I can chat about that. So another question that comes up for this conversation is, how close to failure or to failure should you go average in a mesocycle or just in any average training session? I think I'll put my thoughts forward, and Paul, we'll see what you think. My thinking is that the stimulus per repetition, the closer or per set, if we compare different sets to each other, the closer you go to failure, linearly pretty much, the higher the stimulus increases. And I think that even continues after failure. So if you have forced reps, I think the stimulus still continues to go up. So if you have one set in which you have to do or die, you just get you showed up, the leg press is already loaded, you're warmed up, but the gym closes in 2 minutes. You have time for one set. You'd better get your friends over to do a strip set beyond failure, because that's as much stimulus as you're going to get in one set. But so I think that in any one set or any one session, everything to failure or beyond is best practice. However, we can't just think of one session at a time. In any one session, you have to ask two questions. One, how good of a stimulus am I getting in this session? And two, how does this set me up fatigue-wise for the next session? Because we have to have some sustainability. If you just trash yourself in one session, you have a longer recovery, or you might have to skip a week, and so on and so forth. So the next question is, what is the relationship between going to failure and fatigue? And I have observed, and this is confirmed by some literature, but a lot of it's observational.
Mike, I'm totally okay with us talking observationally and anecdotally.
Sure.
We don't have to throw PubMed at each other all day, because
for sure. I just want to mention that there is some literature reference to this. The fatigue relationship to failure proximity seems exponential. It's not linear, right? So that you get linearly more benefit as you do closer to failure and beyond, but the fatigue goes like that. And I think the the ascension happens around 1 rep from failure. At failure, you're well into that near vertical fatigue escalation, and going beyond failure is way, 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 way higher fatigue. So what I think is in the first several microcycles of your mesocycle, that staying a little short of failure is probably a good idea because it gives you a real good stimulus, not the best, but a really small amount of fatigue. And then as you require a presentation of greater overload, eventually you get to failure, maybe even beyond it at the end of the mesocycle. But the fatigue accumulation is going to be so great, you have to deload, cool everything down, and then repeat, which is why I'm not a huge fan of going all the way to failure every single week of a mesocycle in all of the sets, because I don't think that's the most sustainable. And over the mesocycle, I don't think it has the best stimulus to fatigue ratio.
Yeah, and there's so many parts here touch upon. I don't totally disagree, and I told Mike that. I said I don't think we're going to end up disagreeing on as much stuff as people want us to, which is what most everybody wants, right? They want schoolyard fights, right? Exactly, because people are always tagging Mike and my stuff. That I knew once we got on here, we actually started discussing modalities that would be more things that we connected on than actually disagreed with. I don't disagree with that at all. For example, I think if you're doing a set of squats, or we talked about earlier, I don't program deadlifts for people who are using deadlifts in a hypertrophy cycle. I don't feel like when we talk about failure, and Mike, let's define. To me, defining failure is true failure. You can't perform another repetition. Okay, so let's start there and just defining failure. You can't. I don't know the last time I did a set of squats where I feel like you can get as much stimulus as you're going to need out of a set, say a good set of squats, or even potentially hack squats, without ever hitting true muscular failure. And I do believe in certain movements like that have a high degree of intramuscular synchronization that's required, the coordination that's required. There's a lot more demands that come from the nervous system during the performance of the movements. For example, it's a lot more systemically demanding to do, say, a hard set of barbell rows for, say, 8 reps than it is side laterals to go into failure, right? You could probably, if I told you, Mike, every day for the next month to go in and do a complete failure set of squats for 8 reps, at the end of the month, you probably really fucked up if you even made it, right? But you could definitely go in and do a set of side laterals, warm up to failure for 8 reps, 1 set, and leave and never have a problem for the whole month. So you have to weigh those things a little differently within your training program. Mike was making a good point there. It's when you think about the training session, that's kind of why, God, there's so much good discussion right here with Mike's points they got there. Is that's something I think people need to think about too. So once you get your movements dialed in, your biomechanics dialed in, it's not just thinking about the one session per se. It's thinking about the amount of fatigue you're going to accumulate on a per session basis at a systemic level, and then how much that accumulates over the course of the week in conjunction to what you can recover from. So if you have, let's say, a block of stimulus, right? Let's just look at training like a stimulus session, right, over the course of the week. And this is your amount that you can recover. Well, you're just back at baseline. You're really just, and we've had this discussion before, you're training to get fucking tired, right? So that's what's happening. There has to be a gap here where here's your stimulus and here's the amount you can recover and here's your adaptation that's going to happen, which is what we're looking for there is muscle growth, right? So we have to be able to recover beyond the degree of stimulus that we're supplying, not just on a per training session basis, but a weekly session basis, multiple weeks, multiple months, because muscle growth is slow, right? You need the stimulus, you need the recovery, the adaptation occurs, and you need enough cycles of that so that there's enough remodeling that, hey, we're fucking big and jacked now.
Sure. So
what it comes back to is how you're going to manage that stimulus. So like Mike's saying, it's for example, I may do a set of warm up and do a set of squats or hack squats. And if I have, I would say on average, probably 1 or 2 RIR for a set of hack squats. But if I do leg curls or leg extensions, that's just going to be balls out, right? And it's probably not going to be more than 1 set, sometimes 2. So sometimes there'll be 2 sets in there. So from that standpoint, what I figured out for myself individually is managing that stimulus to fatigue ratio that's happening within specific movements and how much stimulus, i.e. volume, that I'm applying to those on a per session basis so that I don't feel beat to shit after a couple of weeks of training, right? I mean, you have to be able to train pretty damn hard for enough weeks on end to allow that stimulus to recovery ratio for that adaptation to occur. It's got to be enough productive cycles of that to happen over time. So some people like it, and I think, Mike, you do this some of your mesocycles where you actually set it up to kind of do an overreaching type cycle where you're pushing pretty hard, and then you deload. And then one thing I've been thinking about lately is I don't know if you've seen the data on this kind of stuff, is that really you kind of want to have periods where you detrain a little bit to allow your mTOR to become a little bit more sensitive again, that you kind of become a little bit more training sensitive to the stimulus again. And Mike, you might have seen this anecdotally either with yourself or with clients as well, is that the longer that you go where you're going hard in the paint without a break, it's almost like you're not getting anything more out of the training at that point. It's like you're beating your head against that wall. Maybe you're recovering, but it's just like your body's just like, man, I know what you're doing. I can, I've adapted to this. You're not doing anything different.
Yeah. I think the way you start to realize that is that the number of sets it takes for you to get the same pumps that you used to starts to go up. The number of sets it takes for you to get sore like you used to really goes up, but the number of sets that you can recover from doesn't go up nearly as much. So that, like, if your maximum ability to recover is 10 sets per session, you might start with new exercises, really refreshed, really low fatigue at 4 sets and get a good workout. But after 6 months, you start at 8 sets, and even 7 sets isn't a good workout because your body's like, whatever, fuck this, I'm not moving. And then, so like if you start at 8 sets and then you finish at 10 sets, there's only so many weeks that you can progress. And there's now very few weeks because you have to start training so hard. You used to start and you would do 6 weeks and then you deloaded. Now, months later, you're essentially, if you were just adding volume and intensity at the usual, volume and load at the usual pace, now it's 2 or 3 weeks and you have to deload because you have to start so high. So basically your body's desensitized to volume. And then I think we've been doing this for a long time at RP, but just take several weeks, 2 to 4 maybe, of lower volume training, much lower volume training at maintenance volumes, which is like 1/3 of your normal training volume, and just do that. And you really just, the workouts are pure shit, but you're not trying to grow, you're just trying to maintain. And over the course of those several weeks, you drop a lot of fatigue, and then all of a sudden you're ready to do productive training. And the way you know that is you come in and you do 2 sets of bicep curls hard in your normal rep range, and all of a sudden you have a pump from 2 sets. Like if it takes you 8 sets to get a pump, you're probably pretty fatigued and pretty resistant to volume. It's time to drop it off.
Unless the guy is just, if he's inadequate on, say, sodium or carbohydrate intake altogether.
Yeah, for sure. Well, so another interesting thing is, like, when people are dieting, they'll say, like, well, your pump.
Yeah, when you've been dieting long enough, you get a fucking pump to save your life.
Sure. Well, people, it's so funny too, because I've advanced tracking pumps as a measurement of roughly how good your workout is. Like, if you get a good pump, you're probably pretty good, and if you have no pump, maybe you didn't train much, and if you have a pump that goes away halfway through your workout, you're probably overdoing it. And people have said, well, how do you explain dieting? With dieting, I don't really get pumps, and how does that correlate with muscle growth? I mean, exactly as you see, if you're not getting big pumps, you're probably not growing a whole lot of muscle. Case in point, dieting. Who thinks they're growing muscle when they're dieting? They're probably fucking not, and you're not getting pumps. It's not a coincidence.
Bro, the internet's full of people every day want to ask what's the best shredder workout, man. And
shredder.
Yeah, the best workout. Like, should I do this workout to cut? I'm like, I can't even talk to you today. So,
yeah. So on the note of like the stimulus to fatigue ratio stuff and failure proximity, my view on, let's say, your leg extensions example is, what if instead of doing 1 or 2 sets of leg extensions to true failure, we did 3 or 4 sets of leg extensions to 2 reps in reserve or 3 reps in reserve. The next week did 1 or 2 reps in reserve, the week after 1 or 0 reps in reserve, and then the week after that, true failure, 0 reps in reserve, and then deload. My thoughts on that, it would reduce the time efficiency of the workout considerably because you have to do more sets. But because the average stimulus to fatigue ratio of 2 reps in reserve is probably better than 0 reps in reserve, yes, you get less stimulus, but you probably get much less fatigue. I think an average reps in reserve through the meso, like maybe the middle week, if that's 2 reps in reserve, I think we can make our mesocycle last longer and thus get more productive weeks of training with an average more stimulus because of that, versus if we tried to go to failure on more stuff right offhand. Yes, it's very effective, but the fatigue summates more quickly and leads to fewer summated microcycles. What do you think about that, Paul?
I think that you have to kind of measure that out, right? So it's like you said, what we're measuring each time that we do what we both consider a productive set or a set that has like effective growth repetitions in it, is that we're creating both stimulation, but we're creating fatigue at the same time, right? And in the context of this conversation, we say we're creating systemic fatigue. We're creating peripheral or localized muscular fatigue, but generally speaking, you know, it's 48 to 72 hours that you're probably going to be recovered at the localized level, right? We can throw that out. That's been pretty well researched over the course of decades and decades, somewhere between 48 and 72 hours. From a peripheral standpoint, you're going to be recovered. So we're usually, when we're talking about recovery, more times than not, I think what we're talking about is we're talking about systemic recovery, right? So the ability to, that your nervous system is going to be able to fire effectively those high threshold motor units, right? So while we're training. So when it's suppressed or depressed because it hasn't recovered, and that's what we talked about earlier, right? Was when you're fatigued, when you're accumulating fatigue throughout the training week, it's going to get to where your nervous system's like, man, I'm just beat down from the shit you've been doing to me. And I don't want to continue to fire out all those high threshold motor units and activate more muscle fibers because I'm just fatigued. And that can happen from a myriad of things that you're doing within the training session. So what I'm getting back to with that is, so you have the one set where you're going, say my leg extension set where you do one set to failure. So you're accumulating a certain amount of stimulus, right, with that set. And then you're accumulating a certain amount of fatigue within that set. And so Mike's thing is to say, well, what if I could do 3 sets and I'm going to accumulate a little bit, say either an equal amount or a little more stimulus, but I'm going to accumulate a certain amount of fatigue. And that's kind of the quantifiable part that we can't quite put our finger on. I think it's going to come down to an individual kind of basis, right? So because some guys, you take a guy, certainly we were talking about outliers. I think no different than like some people are more sensitive to say alcohol consumption. Well, that's an individual basis thing. We all had know that friend, right? They could drink like 15 fifths of Jack Daniels and not be completely drunk. And then you have the other friend could drink like 1 glass of wine and be almost wasted. I think there's a training stimulus too, right? And I think we all respond a little differently to the training stimulus. And that's going to be both that you take a guy that's one of the most training sensitive stimulus guys I think I ever knew was probably Kirk Kowalski. Captain Kirk and I were buddies too. Kirk could never, he tried a multitude of different ways to train. He could never do more than 1 set. If he did any, and he didn't train to failure, but his heavy sets, when you're doing 655 per 8 on squats, you know, you're going to be pretty fatigued from that. But Kirk could never get up from where he was a really jacked up, wired up guy, right? Like that was his, if you watch any videos on Kirk, you know what I mean, right? So he's a really high wired guy. He was always training on the nerve. So for Kirk, he said he could never do more. And I think when you look at Kirk and see a guy like that doing a set of 655 for 8 on squats for him, that was his work set. But that wasn't a failure, but just that set alone for him caused him to grow significantly, caused him to get strong significantly. In other words, he would have a high degree of stimulus for him from that set, but also a high degree of fatigue, right? He couldn't do more sets, right? Like if he did more sets, he would have just gotten more bogged down with systemic fatigue. Whereas you were talking about James Hoffman earlier, but James might be closer on that scale of being like a more of a non-responder where he doesn't respond as well to the training stimulus as somebody else does. So Kirk's kind of on one end of an outlier. James kind of might be on the other end, or somebody else, you know what I'm saying, that needs more stimulus within the training session. So they don't get fatigued. Think about it this way, Mike. So if we're saying there's fatigue, there's stimulus associated with a set that's taken to whatever proximity to failure, there's also going to be a certain level of fatigue that's going to be associated with that set as well. So for somebody who's training, who maybe, and this is just kind of my own theory, is really training stimulus sensitive, that they're probably fatigue sensitive too, right? And then for somebody who's not very stimulus sensitive, they probably are a little bit fatigue resistant as well.
Usually, yeah.
Yeah, right. So, and then the rest of us can kind of fall a little bit in between. So then I think what that comes back to are a couple of things. Is personal preference. Some people just like training. I like training like balls out, like leaving no reps on the table. Like that's just a big preference of mine. Like Dorian Yates was my favorite bodybuilder, like coming up through the years. And that was something, that ideology was something I gravitated to. And somebody may just like training that way. And then if somebody else who likes doing a little more volume, would prefer to be in the gym a little more time, and then manages that stimulus to fatigue ratio, then sure, if they're not doing as many sets to failure, then I think that kind of equates out, right? So if you're getting 5 effective reps towards growth in the set to failure, and you're accumulating, we'd have to define, like quantify like fatigue in terms of like blocks or something, right? Like 5 fatigue blocks, which is right within the set. We'll throw that out there. I'm just coming up with that on the spot right now. So then you'd have to figure out what are your fatigue blocks or fatigue points within a set if you're 2 reps in reserve or you're 1 rep in reserve. You see what I'm saying? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So in other words, if you were looking at the reps in their proximity to failure and we knew how many stimulating reps were being performed, if we could kind of quantify in a similar parallel fashion the amount of fatigue we were accumulating at the same time, then you could, from a mathematician standpoint, you could actually iron out an almost similar identical training. And then it would just come back to preference for the person. So if you want to go in and train really fucking hard and you want to do 1 set, then do your 1 set. Here's how much stimulus you're probably getting out of that set, and here's how much fatigue you're accumulating. If you're a guy that likes to go in and you do multiple sets, and this kind of speaks to your training soul a little more than doing it that way, then here's another way to do that.
Yeah. I think there's a lot to be said for preference, but I like to keep discussions of preference a little bit different than discussions of optimality, because if you know what's right to do from a strict engineering perspective of this is the optimal solution to your training equation, once you know that, then you can sort of veer away what you like, what you don't like, and understand that you're making trade-offs. So I think preference is something we modify afterwards. I don't think it should be the first thing you take into training with you as far as mentality, because what is it? Dorian Yates quote, they asked him what he thought about instinctive training, because it was popular in the 90s. He said, if I did instinctive training, I would be sitting on the couch drinking a beer right now, because I don't fucking ever want to do bent rows, but I seem to do them all the time because I think they're a good idea. So taking that perspective, I still, my hypothesis is that the average stimulus to fatigue ratio, like how many blocks of stimulus you're getting for how few blocks of fatigue, I suspect that for many people, it's best at around 2 reps in reserve. I think if you get 5 reps in reserve, you're mostly just pissing your time away. I think if you get to 0 reps in reserve, you're getting a lot of stimulus, but that much more fatigue. So if you had to do 3 sets of one versus 3 sets of another, 2 RIR versus 0 RIR, I think 3 sets of 2 RIR would grow you almost as much as 3 sets of 0 RIR. And this has been directly studied, and it turns out it's probably true. Fatigue-wise, I think 3 sets of 0 RIR, I don't want to put a number to it because we don't know these numbers, but I think it's something like double the fatigue. It's a lot more fatigue. It's a huge difference. One of the elements to this is psychology. It takes something very different mentally to get geared up to go all the way to true failure. And it takes something that is not linearly more difficult than 1 or 2 reps from failure. It is exponentially more difficult. Not to say infinitely, but it's much harder to go all the way to failure than to stop even 2 reps short of failure.
Here's my thing about that, is that one of my only biggest issues about it is that I think the majority of guys who are suffering from a lack of progress and frustration is that they don't fucking train hard enough.
What do you mean by hard?
Well, I don't think they have spent any amount of what we talked about earlier, that you need to cultivate that ability to train really hard. And a lot of these guys, when they come in, if they're taught, how do you know as a lifter what a true 1 RIR or 2 RIR is if you've never spent any time really training the true failure? Like I had a guy that told me he thought he was doing 2 or 3 RIR, and then I put him through a real set to failure. He was 9 reps from failure. And that's really fucking common. So what I mean is a lot of these guys don't realize we talked throughout this conversation, one of the things that we talked about is that need to have stimulus, right? The stimulus has got to be enough so that there's got to be adaptation for the body because the body can say, okay, I got to do some remodeling here because of the amount of stress that you have put on me. I need to adapt to that. A lot of these guys, I think, have frustration because they simply haven't spent enough time actually training. They don't know what training to failure is. Like when I take it enough guys through the gym to where they actually train to failure, they're like, wow, I've never done a set that hard. And I'm like, that's how I train most of the time. And I think it behooves guys, here's my thing. I don't have a problem with anything that you're saying per se, as long as the guy actually is really training 1 or 2 RIR. And the problem is, if they've never spent any time really training to failure, they don't fucking know what 2 RIR are.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I think there's some direct research that maybe Eric Helms has done. Steve, you might remember. Is that Eric Helms?
I don't know if it was Eric, but there was definitely a study where people were way off.
Like one of the guys was 14 reps above what he thought his 10 rep max was.
So that's what I mean. Think about that, Mike. If a guy goes in and he's been taught that paradigm from like really early on, and he's constantly been taught stay away from failure, don't get near failure, that kind of stuff, and then he's frustrated with his lack of progress, and he's routine hopping, he's doing all this stuff, when really he just needed to train a little harder.
Sure. I think there's also another group of people, like the average college bro, who goes to failure all the time or too often. There's guys that when they get on the bench press, every set is to concentric failure.
That's well, they max out every Monday.
Yeah, totally. And then they do drop sets of tons of reps. And you know, we've all been approached by people in the gym who are like, you spot me on the bench press? And you're like, God damn it, when do I have upright rows later this week? Like, and they'll say like 5. And I'm like, okay. And I always tell them, I'm a dick nowadays. I'm just like, okay, I'll pull the bar off you when you can't do any more reps yourself. Okay. And they'll say, and they'll get 2 partial reps and then they won't get the 3rd one. I'll just rack it. And I've had a guy turn around and look at me like the gopher meme. He's like, dun, 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 like that. And I'm just like, you did great. And he's like, oh, I thought I had 5. And I was like, oh, like, yes, you didn't.
Because for the weeks leading up to that, the guy's been pulling on the bar the whole time, so they think they'd be doing 8 reps.
Totally. Who knows what they're doing at that point? So, like, for guys like that, I think for guys that you're talking about, which is totally a big fraction of the gym population, you know, if you tell them 3 RIR, and honestly, and I'm very comfortable saying this, I think this affects females slightly more often than it affects males. Like a lot of female trainees, they'll say, I'm doing 3 RIR, and you look at them, you're like, that's not 3 RIR, keep going. And they just keep going and going and going, and then 9 reps later, they're like, oh, okay, I guess now that's 3 RIR. And you're like, yeah, now you're starting to get shaky. And it affects a lot of males too. And then there's another group of people who you're like, okay, let's do 2 RIR. And their last rep is like, and then they rack. You're like, that's not 2 RIR.
Those are the guys in powerlifting who used to call a 7-second concentric rep like a RPE 6 or some shit.
Yes, like a 6. Right? You got to look at your training partners and go, that was like 6, 6.5. And they're like, because you got yes man bullshit training partners that just blow smoke up your ass. So for those guys, I would say practice reserving yourself more, especially early in the mesocycle, and then slowly work up from there. And for the other group of people, especially beginners, intermediates, I think more statistically more likely to be female, they're not even close to failure, and they for sure, maybe if not to failure, they for sure need to go to failure at least sometimes to see exactly what that is, but like just push harder. And I think a lot of people end up doing these high set programs where they could be doing 2/3 of the sets closer to failure and getting way more out of it. That's on the other end of the stimulus fatigue ratio. Like if you do a set of 10 and you could have done 15, that's not a very stimulative set. And you'll have to do like 6 of those to get the same stimulus that you would get from like maybe 3.
Well, honestly, yeah, Mike. But if you're literally 5 or 6 fucking RIR, you're literally like and you're do 5 or 6 sets of that. You're literally your body goes, I got this. There's nothing for me. You're literally it comes back to your training to get tired.
Yep. I think the beginners tend to grow from that because they grow from anything. But that's when people, when you talk about that, I think that's what you're referencing is in that intermediate stage when they say like, I can't grow. And you're like, how hard are you training? And they're like, what do you mean? Well, let's say how close to failure you're going. And if it's really 2 reps in reserve for real, probably pretty good. But a lot of times they think it's 2, but it's 6.
Most of the guys I think that we're probably speaking to more often than not, Mike, what you think are probably fall within that intermediate range.
Yeah, probably. Yeah. But I think half of them are split into hardcore psycho bleed out of my eyes failure means 2 reps in reserve. And then another, maybe half of them, bullshit numbers, but a large fraction of them fit into that stream of, oh, I think I'm training pretty hard per set, but really I'm not. And also I think it depends on the exercise too. I think some exercises like the bench press, for some reason, almost everyone goes to failure on. But then when you get like squats, they're like, no thanks. And then all of a sudden it's like, you know, the ones that bench press, let's be completely honest, bench pressing, unless you're injured, doesn't actually hurt. Like failure shows up and it just kind of, you can't press anymore. Some exercises hurt, like high rep leg presses to failure. Oh my God.
That's what I hope. See, hold on. No, that's what I'm getting back to is when I talk about training that's hard means it's going to challenge you, right? So when you sit down and you're talking about the mental part there, and that was a good point. was like, if you know you're about to knock out a set of 20 on leg presses with a maximal load where it might be a 22 rep max, right? You better strap your balls on for that set. Now, and that comes back to what I was talking about. Most of the guys, I think, that are struggling, if they would do, and here would be my challenge to anybody that watches this that is struggling or whatever, at least do a 6 to 8 week mesocycle of training where you limit your number of sets and just train to failure. So at least you have some type of idea of what that, here's the thing, what that feels like, okay, how you mentally have to get up for those sets and those kind of things. Because if you spent no time doing that, you haven't cultivated, number one, that ability to create that emotional output within the set. And then I don't care what anybody says, like you said, if you're doing a 20 rep set of leg presses or hack squats or squats, whatever, the amount of emotional expenditure that happens before that set, during, and then after is significant. And that's where that nervous system taxation comes from as well, right? It's not just happening at the cellular level. So, but I would challenge those guys that are struggling to pare their volume back, do a good warm-ups, and then really understand the concept of what it means to train to failure. And when you actually have a grasp on that, then you can do a true 2 RIR. Yeah. You can do a true 1 RIR.
I think that's a really good idea. I have another idea that I think people can also use potentially. And this is the idea of trying to match the reps you got in your first microcycle, trying to match them in all succeeding microcycles until you can't anymore. So, because your set numbers might be going up, fatigue accumulates anyway, even if they don't. And you're probably putting a little bit more weight on the bar every week or 2 weeks or something. Let's say you started leg pressing 405 for a set of 20 and you thought that, 3 or 4 RIR, and maybe you were fucking way wrong and it was 8. You do 415 the next week and you have to hit 20 on your first set, whatever else you did on the second and third. You keep putting weight on the bar and you keep training for multiple weeks. At some point, your reps in reserve have to come down if you're really diligent about, I have to hit 20 reps. You will find out what your true failure point is at some point. Yeah. What I really don't like to see is people not trying to meet the same number of reps each week and are relative beginners and intermediates, and they'll let the reps drop off every week because they're like, well, that's 0 RIR, that's 1 RIR, but I was pretty fatigued. Like, yeah, I don't know about that. You have to challenge yourself to say, I'm going to get 20 until I can't get 20. And when you can't, first of all, it teaches you how to do failure. Second of all, you've actually successfully, noted where your failure point is relative to how far you thought it was, which you can save for future mesocycles. And also, you've hit a really proper stimulus to cap off the week, or maybe you have one more week in you, probably not. And then you deload and repeat. It sort of really finishes off your cycle. Like when you can no longer match your reps at increasing loads, or if you can't add a rep or two while your load's the same, then you, by definition, first of all, have to hit failure at some point. And second of all, then you sort of know that for future reference. And I think that I would like to say this because it's been brought up by one or two folks that people should train to failure early in their careers so that they know what that feels like. I disagree with that to a high extent. I think that when you're a beginner, your technique will break down.
Can I finish what you're about to say, though?
Sure.
Okay, I agree with you on this. I don't think you have to. You have so much neuromuscular coordination that's going to happen early on. You don't need to train to failure to get the growth response.
Sure.
So you milk that shit out as long as you can, and then you have another level you can step up to with straight sets to failure to kick that next set of growth phase off.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that irritates the fuck out of me when some guy's been training like 2 years and he's talking about doing drop sets or I'm like, you don't need it, dude. You just progressive overload in your straight sets from here on out. You want to be smart in your training, lifting career about when you're going to introduce higher degrees of effort, because you only get to play those cards so many times.
Yeah.
And when you're a newbie, you're going to grow just off being in the gym and learning the movements. Okay?
Yeah, 100%.
Right? So you want to hold off as long as possible until those gains slow down and then start inching closer to training to failure.
Yep. And also, just to complement that, as you're a beginner, you need to be, number one, prioritizing the establishment of that good technique we were talking about at the beginning of the podcast.
That should be everything early on.
100%. So that if you rush people into failure within the first 6 months of training, like, all right, time to fucking...
You're going to get a lot of shitty motor patterns that they're
going to go straight to hell.
And how they perform those movements when they get fatigued, and that's going to get them fucked up down the road.
I would much rather, if I inherited a lifter let's say 2 years into his career, and he wanted to be the biggest bodybuilder he could be. If I inherited him from just himself or another coach, and you give me two options, two extremes of a lifter, one guy has motor patterns fucking stuck in and he's beautiful on the squats, leg presses, bench, everything looks great, but he doesn't quite know what truly approaching failure is, versus another guy that like is the guy that takes the chest supported row machine, puts 5 plates on it and does like fuck that guy, because that guy, you have to insult his ego first to help him. You're like, you think you do 5 plates on this, now you do 2. You'd be like, 2, what the fuck are you talking about? Like, we have to reteach you how to do good technique, and by definition we can't let you approach failure for several weeks because you can't learn good technique when you're getting close to failure.
Anytime you get somebody that hasn't developed those neuromuscular pathways, I come across this in any of the workshops I do where I'm going over guys with mechanics, and they're doing a certain, like a row or a pull down or whatever, and they think they're contracting their lats. And I'll have other people come over and put their hands on their lats, and I'll say, are their lats contracted fully short? And they'll say no. But they think they are, because the neuromuscular pathways they developed is actually to their upper back, but in their mind they think it's to their lats. So when you get a guy like that that's done this, that's created these terrible motor patterns for execution, what he thinks he's feeling more times than not is not what's he's actually feeling. He's just feeling something else.
Yeah, well, Paul, I think you're cutting that guy a lot of slack. Some guys don't even focus on feeling anything. They're just kind of doing stuff. And, you know, when that fucking metal in your earbuds kicks up, like, you're not feeling shit. You're just crying about, like, the person your father never was to you in your life, or whatever the hell people cry about in the weight room. But, like, that's one of these things where if you have inherited someone who spent their early years perfecting technique, it's relatively straightforward to teach them how to go to failure. You simply stand next to them and you go, you see the perfect technique you have? Now do another rep. Now do another rep. Now do another rep. You're doing great. But the guy who has shit technique and knows how to be hardcore, you have to rewire a ton of shit. That's tough.
Dude, yeah. If you take a beginner and you actually just spend that time teaching them good mechanics, dude, like that, it's so much anyway for a beginner because they don't know any better. But you take a guy who's been doing shit wrong for 5 years and you got to rewire everything that he's doing. Tough, and then half the time they fight you on this shit.
Well, here's a really fucked up thing as far as incentives are concerned for bodybuilding coaches. And Steve, you might be able to weigh in on this because I'm sure you've seen more than your fair share. This actually applies to special sports supplements, wink, wink, as well as it does to training. If you inherit an athlete that has been used to training incredibly hard but incredibly wrong, and or a guy that's been using an infinity amount of gear and is going to die soon, if he's like, oh, you know, I'm hiring you as you're my new coach, let's work together and I'm going to do what you say, you have a year to get me ready for my next show. Half that year is spent reteaching him how to lift weights properly and maybe even getting slightly worse results during that time because you can't push him as hard. And much of that year, if not the whole, is going to be spent taking him down to sane dosages of gear. All of a sudden, you have to tell him, look, I think I can get you better in 2 years if you take all these steps now. In 5 years, you'll be the best you've ever been in a place you never would have gotten with the irresponsible shit you're doing now.
I don't have a theoretical. I have a real life experience with that where I took an IFBB pro guy who we rearranged all his gear use. And we revamped all of his training and programming. And he, over a 3-year span, he went from 218 on stage to 235 and won his first pro show.
Sure. But he luckily, Paul, didn't fire you after 6 months, because a lot of guys will do that. When you tell them, hey, you got to train a little better, you got to use gear a little smarter, that means less of both essentially for a while you're reteaching them stuff. And then you end up, the guy's like, yeah, I went back to working out hardcore like I liked. Like, the stuff was too hard. It's like, you've done assholes an investment.
What we get on is the gear use and its ability to mask the need to fully develop and cultivate all your nutritional and training strategies that are most efficient for you to become developed, right? Yep. And there's so many guys now, and they get on early and they take big cycles, and then you and I we used to have these conversations years ago. It's like when they run into a plateau, the only thing they know how to do is up the dose. And there's somebody we know mutually that basically, you know, became a championship lifter from, you know, knowing how to do those kind of things. And that, to me, it's sad, man, because there's so much that you can milk out of really good nutritional practices, really good training practices that guys just leave on the table because they're in such a rush, to get into the fast gains that you're going to get from anabolics, and don't understand that just like with your noob gains, you're going to hit a wall down the road with that kind of stuff. And if you have not spent time cultivating and developing those habits with your nutritional approach, with your training, with your mechanics, with your movement selections, with good programming, with good training cycles, that kind of stuff, you're just going to keep hitting this wall, and then, you're going to die early probably.
Yeah. The best part is when like non-drug using noobs on YouTube look at that bodybuilder who's taking 10 grams a week and look at his training, and they're like, that's how I need to do curls to get biceps. Like, yeah, because that guy knows anything about curls or anything at all. He knows what his coach tells him, which is pin 3 fucking needles into your delt every fucking other day, and then don't die.
What's even worse about that now with the social media, with the environment that we're kind of living in, is like, I'm legit just on a replacement dose of tests, and have been ever since I retired from it. I was always pretty open about my gear use, right? You know that. And
sure.
Once I retired from powerlifting, I went to a replacement dose of tests. I've never done anything more than that since. And I still get beat up on every day from guys on the net about how much, steroids that I use. And I don't know if it's a compliment or if I just want to punch them in the fucking face.
It's a compliment, I think.
Right? And I'm like, but I've been training 30 years, and I was natural for 20 of those 30. And I spent all of those 20 years, I was completely natural, learning how to eat, learning how to train.
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to cut you off. That's nonsense. Everybody knows that as soon as you take anything, it wipes all of your natural training completely away, and everything you got is exclusively due to the gear. Come on, man. Is this your first day on Reddit or something?
I don't know, man. I stay off there, because when
I stay the fuck off Reddit.
When I found out through Reddit that Hugh Jackman had to be on an excessive amount of tests and be at 189 pounds, I was just like, this is not a world I want to live in anymore.
Steve, congratulations. You are 20 pounds more muscular than Hugh Jackman, and he had to take all those steroids to get there.
What I heard about was like how much his GH cycles had to have costed, and is done.
Wow, GH, huh?
Yeah, man, it's crazy. It's like That's awesome. If you get lean, I don't know what's wrong with the fucking natty world right now, but if you get lean, you got to be on drugs. Yes. Mike, do they know that there's no steroid that burns fat? I wonder if they're aware of the fucking. Are they aware there's no steroid that actually burns fat?
I love my favorite thing while we're on this ranty subject is when forum cocksuckers learn like 3 drug names and they just accuse everyone of all those. Like, I'll post a pic and they're like, how much Tren and ECA are you taking? I'm like, 0 of both. I'm like, do you know any other names? Like, why didn't you say Primo or DHB? And they're like, what's that? I'm like, you don't actually know anything. You know nothing. Your life is a meme. You can be summed up in a meme.
Yeah, there was a guy said something the other day, because I went off on him online, which I don't give a shit about, but he had said something about my Clomid dose. I'm like, bro, I think you mean an AI like a Remedex.
No, Paul, he doesn't know what he means, unfortunately. Steve, did you ever get any experience with folks that you were either consulting or training in which you tried to reel their technique in at the expense of their reps and weight, and they didn't stick it out? Because I've definitely experienced some of that.
Yeah, I was going to say, I've had people where they're basically addicted to training with a certain amount of weight and a certain intensity, where they're basically technique is terrible. They're going all the way to failure and beyond, and it's just all momentum. And you almost have to transition them away from it's like they're addicted to this thing, and you have to slowly eke them away from it.
Things I used to not do because I thought it was nuanced. And Mike, I don't know how much you do this, but I found this to be helpful in that regard. And I used to feel like that it was nuanced, but I really pay attention to it now, because it creates a lot of correctiveness alone, is to actually have them focus on various tempos for a while.
Yes.
And a lot of guys don't do that. As soon as I make someone slow down their eccentric, there's a lot of correctiveness that happens with that alone. You take one of my favorites, take a deadlift, and you'll take a guy that's resetting. He doesn't understand why he's resetting in different positions each time he does a rep. But if you make him slow his eccentric down, he will set it down in the same spot almost every time, over and over again, just from the simple fact that he's having to be very deliberate with what he's doing with his execution, right?
We're writing the scientific principles of hypertrophy training right now, James and Jared and I, and we have a whole section on the different sort of modalities of training, like drop sets, supersets, etc. And each one has its pluses and minuses. One of the pluses on cadence changes, which we basically are pauses and slow eccentrics, or controlled eccentrics and pauses, is, there's no special big benefit to them, but they're really good for if you've just let your technique get away from you a little bit. Like you're saying, like I'm PRing on the squat for reps in bodybuilding. And you used to just sink it all the way down, super upright chest, and it was great. And then like 10 weeks, 12 weeks later, you're hitting big PRs, but you're leaning forward a little bit. You're cutting depth by just a little bit. You're like, I've got to hit these PRs. So what you can do is like a full reset of your technique, slow eccentric, full pause at the bottom squats, which are fucking hard to cheat.
Yeah, dude, you're actually getting into something I meant to get on earlier in our conversation where I was talking about. You can increase or change the stimulus within the training cycle without actually increasing the volume, or a lot of guys without like just throwing the whole routine out. For example, if you're doing hack squats and you're just doing on a normal rep cadence, right? And now you go to a 3 or 5 second eccentric. Well, now you've increased the amount of significant tension that's happening within that entire set. So then you go a few weeks and you do that. And now you add a 2 second pause at the bottom. So now you're doing a 3 to 5 second eccentric with a 2 second pause in the bottom. It's a completely new and increased stimulus the body has to adapt to.
Yep.
Now what I'm going to go in, I'm going to band it. Now I'm going to band it. So then when I'm coming into the concentric, that the resistance curve has changed. So I'm not in a descending resistance curve. I'm in an ascending resistance curve. So now the muscles, the fibers have to work harder across that range of motion.
Sure.
Now I'm increasing the stimulus there. And now a few weeks that, and then I'm going to double band it, right? So I'm deloading in the bottom and I'm still got the stimulus. So there's so many things guys don't think about. I think that there's so many different ways we can increase or introduce a new stimulus into the training session that can spur new gains rather than just guys, like you said, they're getting where they're trying to break rep PRs all the time. And then they're sacrificing technique or form and do so. They're creating bad motor patterns. They're loading the connective tissue more often. They don't know why they're feeling so beat the fuck up, why they're not recovering as well. And like, there's so many other ways you can actually increase the amount of training stimulus within the training session.
Yeah.
And guys don't think outside the box on these things very much.
Steve, I'm going to paraphrase something you wrote, probably poorly, so please correct me. But I think you had an infographic once, and of course with, as usual, excellent description below, of like ways to progress. And you said reps, weight, sets, and also like technique progression, in which every week you may do the same sets, reps, and weight, but you slightly increase the range of motion or you improve the technique. Please tell me that's something you wrote and I didn't just imagine that shit.
No, yeah, I have written probably Instagram too many things on there, but I've probably written something along those lines before where you can improve. I've certainly done it myself where your technique isn't quite there, so you keep it the same and you just work on making sure that that's a little bit better.
Because like it's a really brilliant point to say that that's a completely different type of progression, because sometimes if you combine a bunch of different progression types, your technique can be really tough to really ball bust yourself about because you have other goals to hit. Like, so for example, if you do 150 pounds on the bent row, let's just do one set for a super simple example. 150 pounds on the bent row for a set of 10 in week 1, and 155 for a set of 10 is your goal in week 2. What are you going to be more worried about? How great the technique is in week 2, or that you get all 10 reps at 155? Like, fuck, like we're all men and even women, let's put it this way, we're all lifters and we're all fucking egotistical fucks. And we want that fucking more 5 pounds and the same number of reps. We don't want to drop reps. So I think if you do a cycle sometimes where if your technique has really gotten away from you, of just 150 pounds in the bent row every fucking week for 4 weeks, you're not increasing set. You could increase sets, I guess, but you're not increasing reps. You're not increasing weight. Every week you come in, you say, I'm going to have slightly better technique. I'm going to learn from last time, and I'm going to slightly enhance my mind-muscle connection. Every rep is going to be me feeling my back more than last time. 4 weeks of that, did you progress in weight and reps? No. Are you getting way better stimulus out of the bent row? Yes. And not only did you grow muscle during that cycle, but correct me if I'm wrong, I think you can probably take that into future cycles and now just have better technique going forward. Yeah?
Yeah, and Mike, to add to that, I actually apply that ideology to my lifting and have for a long time. Is I want to be able to own the loading super effectively and mechanically and load the muscle as efficiently as possible before I ever progress on past whatever that loading is. So like, I think it was a few weeks ago, a month ago, I hit a PR in a barbell row. I did 405 for 5, but my barbell rows are very strict. So, but since then, like I haven't gotten back to that, but I'm perfectly okay with still working around that 365 to 385 range for really, really good sets of 6, right? So I'm not going to, unless I feel like, okay, I can do that again, I'm not going to count, I'm not going to go past that loading anymore. For my ego's sake, I want to make sure that when I'm pulling, I'm able to drive my elbows back properly and think about what I'm doing. There has to be an intent on the repetitions. And I'm not just talking about the intent. If your intent is just moving the way A to B, that's okay in some integrated movements. For example, if you're doing a standing shoulder press, you're not feeling your shoulders working, right? Like it's not the same kind of thing. But you still want your mechanics to be on point, so that way you're loading the tissue effectively. And this is just kind of a lost thing with guys, like you're saying. It's like, well, I know I need progressive overload to get stronger, which is true. You need to mechanically load the muscles really well. But it's like going back to, we said something, I think that if there's a gem in this whole conversation, most guys need to understand is that if you want the greatest amount of systemic and localized recovery, and you want the greatest amount of mechanical loading on the muscle, then you've got to choose good movements and you've got to execute them with pristine biomechanics in order to load the muscle effectively. That's going to have how you're going to tax your recovery the least amount, and you have the greatest amount of stimulation, which is the goal in every damn training session that you have, right?
You would think.
You don't want to tax your recovery. A shit doesn't have a little amount of stimulation. That doesn't make any fucking sense.
Yeah, it sucks though, because some, we all, not all, I'll take that back. Some of us at least start with the notion that we're supposed to be training the muscle when we get into the gym, but too many of us, with each successive microcycle of telling ourselves we have to put 5 more pounds of weight on the bar and still get the same reps, get into a situation where the actual goal of training no longer becomes, do I feel my pecs contracting hard? It becomes point A to point B. I just have to yell a lot and do stuff, and I have to hit these arbitrary numbers. Technique suffers, mind-muscle connection suffers, and stimulus to fatigue ratio suffers. And to put a cherry on top of probably most of this discussion, these are not things that come with no downsides other than some theoretical stimulus to fatigue ratio. Because someone could say in response to us, like, yeah, whatever, I'll just deload more often, right? Injury rate is exactly fucking correlated to when you do dumb ass shit in the gym and let your technique slip. How many, for both of you guys, how many people have you seen hurt either under your tutelage or just some random guy in the gym when you look at what they're doing and you're like, I swear to God, this is not good, and then snap, or just they get out and they're like, oh, my knee, like, that's when fucking injuries happen. It's not a costless thing to do really shitty technique and just fucking move the weight, brother. That's gonna hurt you literally. And then what? And the other thing to add on to that, Mike, is that I don't think injuries happen. Like you could, like if, let's say you pull a hamstring when you're sprinting, that's one thing. But I believe the majority of weight training injuries are not in the moment. I think it's an accumulation of bad shit that's been happening for weeks leading up until that moment when the body finally says, man, fuck you. An accumulation of shitty fucking training where you're using all the wrong shit and loading the joints way more than the muscles certainly gets you injured more often, right? Like that, if it's also interesting too, people will do like question mark deadlifts where they round their back like into their asshole and back, and they'll say, oh, I didn't get hurt. It's like, the correct answer is you didn't get hurt yet.
Not right now.
Right. See you in 2 weeks. It's interesting. This is what I'm going to end with, but I forget who the competitor was. I wouldn't name their name anyway. There was a competitor in one of the world's strongest man televised appearances in the early 2000s, and he was doing a car deadlift, and he was exclusively using his upper back. Like it was, well, his whole back. Like this was his deadlift. He wasn't using his legs basically at all. And he was struggling like at the knee. He was doing like one of those, the full round shake when they're completely question mark and they're shaking. And they're like, well, he got a pretty good result. And they're like, oh, he's a really good deadlifter. And then the next event, they're like, has pulled out with back injury. And I was like 20 years old. And I was like, that's a lesson. That's a lesson. Because I was watching him do it. And I was like,
Mike, bring up
die.
An interesting thing right there that you brought up with the whole shaking thing when you watch people shake. So what that is the nervous system. It does that because it's like I have stability, I don't have stability. I have stability, I don't have stability. I have stability. And that's what that shaking is, because it's trying to grab stability throughout the kinetic chain. in order to create the stability that it wants so they can have output at the muscular level. So when you see guys that are shaking like that, one of the guys that I work with, he was a bad shaker, and we had to work on his stability on a multitude of exercises so he'd stop that shaking. But as soon as I would get him to stabilize joints in certain areas, all that shaking shit would stop. But it's funny that you bring that up, that guy hurt his back, right? Because there's no stability. People are like, well, he didn't get hurt then. I'm like, yes, he did, actually. He'll pay for it later.
Yeah, he paid for it very shortly, which was like a good lesson for my young self. I was like, okay, don't do dumb shit. And then I just got hurt doing dumb shit outside of the gym. Like, hey, can you jump on this 30-inch like cement block? Sure. Ow, hurt my knee. Anyway,
I'm about to be 45, Mike. There'll be none of that shit going on in my
dude. Same here. Fuck that.
Hey, Mike, you're not that old, are you? You're more, aren't you 35?
I'm 35, but I've had enough dumb shit happen to me in my life. Actually, because I do jujitsu, I just get to thread all that dumb shit out on the mats. Like any extra spare male energy I have just gets choked right out of me. So I have no need to do anything. Real quick story. There was a pretty good bodybuilder at a gym Nick and I were training at in New York City. And he came in one day and the entire back of his leg was black and blue, like disturbing black and blue. Like the whole area was the size of his fucking hamstring. You see that and you're just like, oh my God. He ripped his full avulsion of his hamstring sprinting against a fellow coworker who told him he was too big to be fast. He was like, there's no way you're fast. And the guy weighed like 290. He's like, yes, I am. He fucking pulled his ham off the bone sprinting. Is there an award for that sort of thing? Like, what exactly was he competing for? He's a serious competitive bodybuilder. He's on tons of gear, which is fine because that's what he wanted.
Right.
What do you win? You don't win anything. So if I have anything, just Paul and I have any one message, just don't do fuckery because that shit will get you fucked up.
Yeah. Or like if you're a competitive bodybuilder, hey, don't max out on the bench press because
God. Oh my God. I can't even.
Don't get me started.
No, seriously. Dude, every other, and it's so, okay. These are guys too that are in the last 3 weeks of prep because that's when their videographer shows up. They're on like 20 different AIs and fucking Halo and they're Winstrol and their joints are dry as shit and they're like, time for a 2-rep max on incline. It's like, you want to tear your pecs. That's what you want. I figured it out.
Yeah. Yeah, you have to be smart enough to take your foot off the gas in some area of your life, or you're going to pay for it.
Good thing.
And I hope there's some new listeners to this because a lot of the mistakes, I mean, I've been injured less in the last like 3 years than I was in the first like 5 years of my training because
even though you're stronger now.
Exactly. And it's taking into consideration all the points that you guys are saying, movements that work for me in terms of like biomechanics, making sure that I'm using full range of motion, my muscle connection, good technique, not kind of using momentum and doing things I shouldn't be doing. So I hope if there are new listeners or rather new lifters listening to this, they're taking that away. And something I just wanted to quickly summarize for your discussion on kind of proximity to failure. I think neither of you were saying you should never go to failure and you should never leave reps in reserve. And I think that's kind of the big takeaway. There's kind of a lot of shades of gray within proximity to failure. And confirm if that's kind of where you were going with that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. Yeah, and it's like I told Mike, I said, I think that we're going to end up agreeing. I think even in Mike, I think will tell everybody this, that there's going to be a lot of more things he and I end up agreeing on. If you're going to ever max out your genetic potential as far as muscular growth, there's got to be some years, no matter what, where you just train your fucking ass off as hard as you can. There's really no way to get away from that. And, it comes back to being, I think, smart in your training cycles, doing the things that keep you injury free, doing the things that maximize your recovery, both in the gym, both at a nutritional level, both at a life stress level, because all of those stresses are stresses. And then like I said, me and Mike, the one thing I think that we've hit on, I think people really need to understand is maximizing your movement selection and your execution in order to get the greatest amount of stimulation in the gym without needing the greatest amount of recovery. And if you're doing all of those things, you'll have good progress. And then, if you to me, training to failure, like I said, is something I personally love to do. And it'd even be one of those things where if Mike could come here with like a crystal ball and say, well, Paul, if you train a little less hard, you actually have more results. I'd be like, I will take the less results because I just like fucking training that way. But I've been training 30 years. I don't give a shit. If I get any bigger anymore at this point. It's a love of actually the doing. But for the guys who are trying to move from that intermediate to advanced, or they're trying to figure out, I think Mike and I both dropped some pretty good gems today. Number one, don't train to failure too early. Maximize your effectiveness on your movements and your movement selection very early on. You're going to get a lot of growth just from going to the gym. Probably even at a 4 or 5 RIR early on, new guys are going to grow off that. And when you hit those intermediate phases, spend those years pushing your intensity. When we talked about effort, spend those years where you're pushing and you're cultivating and you understand that ability to what it means to train really hard balls out, and you're going to grow from that. You don't need the drop sets or the cluster sets or the, any of that kind of stuff to grow at that point. Those intermediate guys, if you look at this in stages, beginner guys, probably they're going to grow through anything. Intermediate guys need to learn how to train really fucking hard, right? And then advanced guys, that's when we start pouring on the stuff like the cluster sets, drop sets, doing stuff like we're a little more worried about the resistance profile of movements, so that we're creating the maximum amount of tension across the muscle fibers in the range of motion and those kind of things. There is so much you can do to milk gains out without getting stupid for your first 5 to 7, 10 years of training. And if you're just smart during those years and you remain injury free and you maximize your biomechanics, you make a lot of progress just off those things alone.
All I'll say is, Paul, you seem like a real smart guy. You know what you're doing. Unfortunately, all that shit is wrong. Let me show you guys. It really is. You guys want to grow, right? I'm Dr. Mike Israetel. I'm a professor. Go to my website. The Hugh Jackman cycle is on there. You can look just like Hugh Jackman. You're going to have to buy some shit from India that's not legal in America.
An affiliate link. Affiliate link for this.
Link in bio, right? That's it. The Hugh Jackman cycle. Steve, we're all gonna get in business together. We're gonna do the Jackman training program. I'm sure we're too small to fish for him to ever sue us. It's gonna be great.
And on that bombshell, guys, if you want to find Paul, where's the best place to people reach out to you? I think from what I've seen, Instagram you're pretty active over there.
Yeah, what's funny is I still don't even have a website to this day. The funny thing about social media, and I'm sure Mike probably feels the same way, it went from a thing where it's like 5, 6, 7 years ago when it was kind of fun, and now it's just all about business anymore. So yeah, if somebody Googles my name, they'll usually find me, or you can Google Lift, Run, Bang.
Fantastic. And Mike over on Instagram as well.
Yep. RP Dr. Mike on Instagram, RSM Periodization, at RP Strength on Instagram, and bang on the internet, because your boy doesn't lift or run. I'm just about, you know what I'm saying? You know what I'm saying.
I'm retired powerlifter. Mike's a retired lady killer. So
yeah, I retired before I had a career.
I'll make sure all of that is linked in the bio so you can get on to all of it as soon as possible. I want to thank these guys massively for coming on and having this chat, because I think it's brought out some really important topics, and there's always things to learn and lines to draw out, and we get further again to the truth and further towards the information that people want for growth, which all the listeners want. So yeah, thank you guys, and we'll catch you soon.
Thanks for having me on, guys.
Peace.